Hello, everyone. This module will discuss Chapter 5, Modern Biosocial Perspectives of Criminal Behavior. As stated last week, this week is an extension of the discussion around the connection between criminal behavior and biological and physiological traits. If you recall from last week, the general argument that was made was that criminals are physically and biologically different from non-criminals. And because of that, the assumptions in this perspective is that individuals have genetically and biologically linked characteristics that predispose them to criminal behavior. A second assumption made by this perspective is that individuals' genetic and biological characteristics interact with their environments to produce criminal behavior. This chapter then discusses physiological factors that contribute to criminal behavior and an early emphasis on biological aspects of offending. So there were lots of different studies that have been conducted to examine whether or not there's a link between biology and criminal behavior. Those studies have come in the form of twin studies, family studies, and adoption studies. And then lastly, this chapter discussed the connection between neurotransmitters in crime and hormones in crime. A large part of what is discussed in biological crime literature is whether or not criminal behavior is a function of nature or nurture. If criminal behavior is a function of nature, then what that means is that people commit crimes because they are biologically wired for the purpose of committing crime. However, if criminal behavior is the product of nurture, then what that means is that through interacting with other people and socialization in the family setting, in peer groups, and other social groups, individuals are taught to engage in criminal behavior. This has been a long debate among social scientists whether or not behavior is the product of nature or nurture. Well, from this perspective, the biological perspective that is, they argue more that criminal behavior is from a function of nature. And so there have been several studies that have been designed for the purpose of testing whether or not behavior is a function of nature or not. Your textbook talked about several family studies. So, for example, there were several families like the Dugdale Jukes family and the Goddard Cadillac family. These families had high proportions of children from these families that grew up to become criminals. And as a result, these children who grew up to become criminal adults, had children who also grew up to become criminals as well. And so what they observed in both of these families is that there was a generational practice of engaging in criminal behavior. And they identified that some families seem to have criminality more in their family bloodlines and generations than other families. In their studies of these two different families, they also found that criminality by the mother had a stronger influence on future criminality of children than did father's criminality. The second type of study outside of the family studies that have been conducted were what are called twin studies. There are two types of twins, monozygotic twins and fraternal twins, who are dizygotic twins. Monozygotic twins are essentially what we call identical twins. Identical twins occur when we have a egg. That egg is fertilized, and then that egg then splits. When that happens, those two children that come from that type of fertilization will share 100% of the same gene material. However, fraternal twins are different because with fraternal twins, there are two eggs, and both of those eggs are fertilized by different sperm. When that happens, then those two children that are fraternal twins will share 50% of the same genetic material. Twin studies then examine concordance rates between fraternal and identical twins. Concordance rates is just a term that means shared traits. And specifically, the shared traits that twin studies were interested in looking at is whether or not they shared the same trait of criminal behavior. And what they found in these twin studies was that identical twins were more likely to share the trait of criminal behavior than fraternal twins. They attributed this to the fact that identical twins share 100% of the same gene material, whereas whereas fraternal twins only share 50% of the same genetic material. And in these twin studies, they found that this was the case even when twins weren't raised under the same household. So, for example, if you had a set of identical twins and they were separated at birth and raised by different individuals, if one of those twins engaged in criminal behavior, it was highly likely that the other twin also would engage in criminal behavior, even though they had never met each other and were raised by different people. This was not as true when we talked about the fraternal twins or the dizygotic twins. So the findings then that I just described then suggest that there's a strong link between biological links between individuals and criminal behavior. And then lastly, there were adoption studies. Adoption studies, again, tested whether or not there was a nature versus nurture relationship with crime. A guy named Mednick, for example, looked at adopted children from 1927 to 1941, and he found that the biological parents' criminality had a stronger effect on children than the criminality of their adoptive parents. So, for example, if a child was adopted and that child's biological parents were criminals, that child was highly likely, him or herself, to engage in criminal behavior, even though they had never interacted with or even met their own biological parents. This suggests that there is a strong genetic link between biology and crime. Children with no parental criminality were least likely to commit crimes. This suggested then that nature was stronger than nurture. And then there were also studies that looked at twins separated at birth. So, for example, there was a University of Minnesota study that showed that twins had similar tendencies toward criminal behavior even when they were separated at birth. And I just mentioned this in another slide. Some other studies that have looked at the link between biology and crime were what are called cytogenetic studies. So, for example, the XYY super male, we know that males tend to have an X and Y chromosome, but sometimes there's a genetic abnormality that may have them have two Y chromosomes, and when that happens, then that person is classified as a super male. Well, studies have found that super males are 13 times more likely to have behavior disorders than your regular XY males. And many people argue that this is because of the extra Y chromosome. Then there have been studies that have looked at the relationships between hormones and criminal behavior. So, for example, testosterone is a hormone that is oftentimes associated with aggression. And some studies have found that when individuals have higher levels of testosterone, that they also have higher levels of aggression and risk-taking behavior, which all places a person at high risk of engaging in crime. Likewise, some studies have also shown that when women have higher levels of estrogen, specifically during their menstrual cycles, then they're also more likely to engage in criminal behavior. Other studies have looked at other hormones and neurotransmitters, such as dopamine. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter, which is basically a hormone that sends messages between the brain and the body that is linked to good feelings. What they found is that using certain drugs like cocaine and methamphetamine will increase dopamine production. Hence, people will oftentimes seek those drugs out for the person for the purpose of increasing those good feelings. Another hormone is what's called serotonin. Serotonin is a hormone that's important to help us with processing information in our brain. Whenever a person has low levels of serotonin, then that's been found to be linked to criminal offending. Other biological research has looked at the link between brain injuries and crime. So, for example, the temporal lobe appears to have the most consistent associations with criminal offending, and that is the part of our brain that helps us with rationalizing. The frontal lobe is the area of the brain where the realm of higher level problem solving and executive functioning takes place. They found that moral reasoning relies on this executive area of the brain because it is the region that considers long term consequences. Whenever a person has an injury to the frontal lobe, then they will not be able to adequately consider long term consequences of their behavior, which, of course, then would place them at risk for engaging in criminal behavior. There were other biological tests that were reviewed in this chapter. However, those were just a few that I wanted to discuss. Lastly, I'd like to mention that recently, biological criminologists have examined the relationship between biology and social environment. This is called a biosocial approach toward explaining criminal behavior. Biosocial criminologists argue that genetics and environment together influence criminal behavior. Physiological variable interactions with environmental variables can produce criminal behavior. So, for example, there's a relationship between behavior and one's physical makeup, right, and one's social environment. For example, diet and exercise. People have found that when individuals live in a certain neighborhood and their diet is poor because of the type of neighborhood that they live in, then those individuals can be influenced to engage in criminal or aggressive behavior. So we know that your poorer neighborhoods, for example, tend to have decreased access to healthy food. What types of neighborhoods are your healthiest restaurants and grocery stores located in? Well, your Whole Foods, your Fresh Market, Wegmans, those types of high quality grocery stores don't tend to be located in the most poorest of neighborhoods. And because of that, the people who live in those neighborhoods do not have the type of access to healthy food as those who don't. As a result, they may have to eat food that is less healthy. They may have to eat more fast food, which has been found to be not healthy, and in some cases have been found to have hormones that other foods don't have, and additives that other foods do not have. As a result of ingesting unhealthy food, people's biology may be impacted, and hence their behavior may be impacted as well. So that's just an example of how there is possibly a connection between one's social environment and their biological makeup, and how that might impact their actual behavior. Policy implications. What can we do about this? What policies and practices are in place to deal with these types of issues if there is some validity about the relationship between biology and crime? Well, most states, or a good number of states, have mandated preschool for all children, health care for pregnant mothers, and early intervention. And then finally, checking hormone and neurotransmitter levels. These are just some of the biological practices and interventions that can be put into place or implemented to help out with this problem. Please read over this chapter for a fuller understanding of the things that I've reviewed in this video. And please look at the assignments that are listed for this week, and please complete them as soon as possible.